Welcome back. This is Lecture 5 in the Israel and Prophecy Part 1 series of the CBE video courses. Let me backtrack for just a moment before we begin and cover a base that I think I left unattended last time, just in terms of scriptural reference. Turn over, if you will. I had made mention of the reference in Ezekiel to the reunification of the 12 tribes that coming together, once again, of the 12 tribes of Israel that were separated back in the 700s BC during the Assyrian successive waves of deportation. If you will look then at chapter 37 of the book of Ezekiel, this is what I, in essence, made reference to, where it talks about taking a stick in verse 16. Moreover, you son of man, take one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions, and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in your hand. So this particular prophecy indicates, it heralds, it forecasts a time somewhere in the future, because the 12 tribes have never been reunited in the full-blown form that this particular passage and prophecy implies. Now, having closed that loose end, if you'll turn over to the book of Acts, chapter 5. I want to start this session. Last time we ended, and as I customarily will do, let's go to the workbook questions. Page 11. In the last lecture video or audio tape, we covered material that it really, in essence, touched on the first two questions in your workbook. We'll pick up now in a moment or two with question 3, and then work our way through this particular lecture and probably one more, completing this unit that we're covering now on the history of the British Israel idea. Before we get into that directly, what I want you to do is take a look in Acts, the 5th chapter. There are 2 verses here which are very telling verses. You may recall the setting. Peter and the apostles, very shortly after the establishment of the New Testament church, as recorded in the book of Acts, they were confronted by members of the Jewish establishment, the religious officials of the day. They were told that they should not be preaching this gospel about Jesus Christ. And of course, in a classic passage, which I think many in the church have committed to memory, Peter and the other apostles answered those who were trying to stop their voice from going out, giving a witnessing message. They answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. Then it goes on to explain how Peter rehearsed the story of what had happened with Jesus Christ, his crucifixion and the like. In verse 32, they were witnesses. Verse 33, when they heard that, they were cut to the heart. They were very angry. And these representatives of establishment religion within the culture of Judaism of that day, it says that they were so angry that they took counsel to slay them. And then, verses 34 through 36 are really critical here. Then stood up one in the council, a Pharisee, whose name was Gamaliel, a man of great renown and a man who held great respect among those that happened to be there. He was a doctor, it says, among the law. He had a reputation among all the people, and he commanded them to put the apostles forth a little ways, a little space, as it says in the old authorized version. Then verse 35, he said unto them, you men of Israel, listen to yourselves, take heed to yourselves. What you intend to do as touching these men is a very important thing. In verse 36, for before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, and a number of individuals, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves. And this man who rose up from the midst of the people and gathered together a following of 400 people, he was slain. He died. His work came to nothing. And all, as many as obeyed him, they were scattered, and the whole business was brought to nothing. And after this man rose up, Judas of Galilee, in the days of the taxation, he drew away many people after him, and he also perished. And all, even as many as obeyed him, they were dispersed, broken up before the winds. Now, I use this example because it touches upon something, a principle, if you like, that we're going to look at in terms of our examination of those people who have contributed to the discussion, the development of the British Israel idea. The example here is a fascinating one because in the plan of God, in terms of God's master plan and the unfolding of the plan of salvation for humanity, on the eve, on the verge of God sending His Son, His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to do the work, to perform the ministry for the 3.5 years which He performed, you find, what shall we say, red herrings drug before the people of Judea. The two individuals that are mentioned here in the book of Acts in the 5th chapter are illustrative of this. And I suspect that it shows a principle, that when phases or stages or plan or parts of the plan of God are about to be implemented and introduced, there is a great spirit being, a fallen archangel, who is not at a loss for coming up with ways to try to muddy the waters, to make things clouded, to make them unclear, and to create doubt, to create difficulty, to bring into discredit, might be the best way to phrase it, the messengers that God actually indeed has endorsed and authorized and sent. Now, that brings me to the place that I'd like to come now. The next person, and this will be cited in your workbook questions under number 3, the next person that I'd like to discuss is a man whose name was Richard Brothers. He's oftentimes known in the literature as Brothers the Prophet. I suspect that this man was in all probability a red herring. And I think as we discuss the issue, it will come clear as to why. Brothers was Canadian born. He was born in the year 1757. He lived until 1824. For a period of time, he served in Her Majesty's or His Majesty's Royal Navy, and eventually, after his tenure in the Navy, he settled in England, leaving his native homeland of Canada. Brothers was a self-styled prophet. He perceived himself as a messenger sent from God to deliver England from what Richard Brothers almost certainly, totally and completely believed was divine revelation that had been given to him directly from God. He believed he received these revelations. He trumpeted them throughout British society in different ways, through different means. And in essence, Richard Brothers was one of those figures, significant, but certainly on the lunatic fringe, we might say, of British religious life. He may well have been deranged, had a distorted mind. I guess, once again, it's one of those things that only at the marriage supper of the Lamb will we have answers to some of these questions. But he claimed descent from a rather prestigious pedigree. He said that he was descended from no less than James, the brother of Jesus Christ, and King David of ancient Israel. Now, that would be lofty enough a claim of and by itself. He added to this the demand that the reigning King of England, a man named George III, and those of you who are students of American history are probably quite well acquainted with the tyrannical King George as he was perceived in the colonies. Richard Brothers, demanded that George III surrender the crown and the throne to him, obviously putting himself in a very precarious position and ultimately being arrested and incarcerated, having in essence committed the crime of treason, among other things. Brothers, one of the scriptures that he fell back on, among again many, which he developed and discussed, wrote about and spoke about in his ministry, we find one that is central over in the book of Matthew, chapter 12. If you'll take a look. Let's see. Okay, let's leave that to the side for just a moment. We'll come back to it in a minute. But he defined himself as the nephew of the Almighty. Among the things that brothers decided to do, what he did in terms of trumpeting his warning message to the people of England, he wrote letters to dignitaries, some of the most influential and prestigious people in British government, not the least of which would have been the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger. On one occasion, he actually attempted to deliver a prophetic message before the House of Parliament. He sought to dissuade British authorities from participating in the warfare that was going on the continent of Europe at that time. The context of his prophecies and his ministry was that of the French Revolution of 1789, and then on down the line through the Napoleonic Wars, the period that followed immediately after the French Revolution. He was a vocal opponent of British colonization, and in the long run, he spent time in debtor's prison, finally to be accused then later of treason for aspirations that he had toward to take the British throne. All of this came in context, a historical context of an extremely turbulent, tumultuous, dangerous period in European history. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and you can well imagine that King George III and the many others that surrounded him looked askance at the kinds of things that Richard Brothers told and preached, the demands that he made, the things that he wrote about, and so on. Nevertheless, as often is the case in turbulent times like this, in revolutionary periods, oftentimes prophets, people who have insight into the future, or at least claim they do, those individuals are listened to by at least a portion of the population. What little record we have, the coverage of Brothers' career in British periodical publications and newspapers, it would give us reason to believe that Richard Brothers drew his support primarily from the lower classes, the less educated classes, the less well-to-do in British society. However, he had others as well. One, in fact, member of Parliament, actually came to Brothers' aid and assistance, eventually even wrote on his behalf. That Brothers was well known is certainly assured. He was written about, as I've already mentioned, in the various publications of the country, and two of the the foremost cartoonist, really, probably of the period in England, a man named James Gilray and another named Isaac Cruikshank. They were caricature artists, and they themselves contributed some of their skills to leave a record behind a Brothers' rather seamy career in terms of the role he played in British religious life. Some of his prophecies made a big impression because there were at least a few that did come true. In 1792, Richard Brothers came out with a book called Revealed Knowledge, and then there's a lengthy subtitle beneath it. You'll find reference to it in the bibliographical section, the selected bibliography that we have in your workbook. Probably the two most significant forecast which he made: number one, the assassination of Gustavus III, the King of Sweden, and in 1793 that indeed occurred. He also predicted that there would be a declaration of war by the United States of America upon the British, and it took a little bit longer time in coming, about 20 years in fact, but in 1812 once again that took place. Now Brothers, as you can tell, if you take your workbook and page to the back in your selected bibliography, look toward the beginning, and what you will find will be a listing of three of the most significant of Richard Brothers' works. He did produce a great deal. He left behind a very detailed and elaborate record. The thing that I want to focus on regarding Brothers is that many people who are critics of the British Israel idea are very rapid to point out, and indeed, in fact, there are those as well who make reference to the fact that Richard Brothers is the one who established. Richard Brothers is the one who founded the idea. He is the one who clearly laid out and articulated the entire British Israel argument. In fact, and I've spent a good bit of time in various libraries, particularly the British Museum, the British Library, and also the University of Texas Ransom Humanities Library, where one of the most important volumes that I'll mention here in a moment comes into play. But when you read through the broad sweep of Richard Brothers' writings, what you will find is that references to British heritage and ethnicity being tied to Israel, there are those, but they are incidental, they are miscellaneous, they're never developed in a thorough, full-blown form in an academic sense, like a scholar might point by point lay out an argument and prove it, or perhaps even more importantly, in a scriptural sense, where verses in the Old and or the New Testament are brought into play, showing how those passages of Scripture may well relate and build the case on the Bible itself for the identity of Israel in modern times. Rather, when Brothers mentions these things, he treats them almost in a matter-of-fact fashion, and certainly as divine direct revelations, which Richard Brothers had received, at least by his own lights, given to him by God. In Revealed Knowledge, there is one telltale reference where there's a mention of some of the British aristocracy being descended from Joseph, but the bulk of the claim oftentimes focuses in on one particular work that is attributed to Richard Brothers. Now, if you go to the various search tools and search devices looking through bibliography, or if you read the literature about Richard Brothers and those people who have written works designed to sketch his career, especially if the intent of the author is in an unflattering fashion, what you'll find invariably is a reference to a book called A Correct Account of the Invasion of England by the Saxons, showing the British nation to be descendants of the lost tribes. And the volume is typically dated in the year 1822, a time during which Brothers would have been in the latter stages of his life and incarcerated as well. When I first saw this, it grabbed my attention because this would be a really significant piece in the body of literature on British Israelism. It sounds, based on the title, like a work that lays a foundation for making that connection, making a case that the Israelites are tied to the modern day British peoples. And it took me quite some time to even find a copy of the book. When I finally did, some interesting things occurred. Firstly, let me say that the book exists, at least as I've been able to find it, in only one of two libraries in the United States. Both of those libraries have it in special collections and will not let it leave their facilities. The first is the Pennsylvania State University Library. And at the time that I found this reference, I was living in the state of Texas. The second, hook 'em horns, the second is at University of Texas at Austin. When I found it, something fascinating occurred. The title that it is filed under, and in fact when I was able to visit the Ransom Humanities Library on the Austin campus of University of Texas, this is the title which in fact the book is given. A Correct Account of the Invasion and Conquest of the Roman Colony of Albion or Britain by the Saxons. Significantly, substantively different than the second half of the title, which you find referred to in many of the other reference works. That title, that second half specifically being showing the British nation to be descendants of the lost tribes. I went to Austin. I went into the little private room that they gave when you go into special collections, and I spent about 2 to 3 hours working my way through the volume, looking for the references which in my mind would nail down the fact that Richard Brothers was the individual who, at least in published form, floated the idea, developed the idea, and rigorously made the connection. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The book itself includes only 2 references to what one might even loosely define as British Israel theory or associations. And these both references, which I'll read for you in a moment, both of these are almost parenthetical statements that are inserted into the text in the context of a much larger, fascinating reading, to be sure. Whether or not it's historically accurate, I would say it's anybody's guess, and probably not. But Brothers provides for the reader an intricately detailed description of how the Saxons, the Angles of the Saxons, eventually came to occupy that southeastern corner of Britain, and then ultimately went on to become the dominant political force in the British Isles. The book itself, 4 sentences at most, out of this Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center volume, out of a sum total of 142-page book, we have these 2 quotes. Regarding Saxon origin, Brothers writes, "They," meaning the Saxons, "were the greatest part of the 10 tribes carried into captivity by Shalmaneser and placed on the borders of his empire near Georgia and Armenia as military guards against the Tartars. They were stationary in Poland with the Vistula for their barrier in Caesar's time, and they did not reach further than the second barrier, the Elbe, until the year 300. For thus, by degrees, they conquered, then rested, and multiplied." That appears on pages 61 and 62 of that particular volume. Then on page 120, again, another reference, a miscellaneous parenthetical allusion. The Saxons, or the Saxons, traditional accounts, though very imperfect, from length of time and variety of settlements, with almost a constant state of warfare to dispose some and oppose other great bodies of people, gave them a faint knowledge of their numerous long journeys, their Asiatic, which is to say Middle Eastern origin, and where they came from. That is essentially it. Now, Brothers was committed in the year 1795. He was in and out on an occasion or two, but he spent most of the remainder of his life either imprisoned or ultimately in a lunatic asylum. I want to read a quote from the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia. This is a typical kind of thing that you'll encounter in the reference works under headings of British Israelism or Anglo-Israelism. The claim is made here that Richard Brothers, quote, took these various ideas about the Anglo-Saxons being Israelites, and systematized and raised them to the dignity of a creed out of which the modern Anglo-Israelite movement has grown, end quote. I would suggest that this is a recklessly overdrawn statement. The systematization is simply not there in Brothers' works. He had many things to say, but connecting ancient Israel to the modern British people, or the British people of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was not by any means his first or his foremost objective and goal. And in my mind, it raises the question again, much as we looked at in the account in Acts chapter 5. Was Richard Brothers, in the spirit of those 2 individuals described and spoken of by Gamaliel, was Brothers a red herring? Something that was drawn in front of the pathway to distract attention at precisely the time that an important phase of God's plan, in this case, the release of the withheld birthright blessings and promises to the descendants of the patriarch Joseph. It's precisely that time that Richard Brothers comes on the scene, a man popularly perceived to be deranged, a lunatic, a man who spent a good bit of time in an asylum, and a man who can be associated with these notions that ultimately became a part of the whole matrix of British Israelite ideas. Might it be that Satan used brothers as an agent somewhat similar to what we read about in Acts chapter 5, at about the time when that birthright blessing, when the inheritance of those physical, material promises of the Abrahamic covenant were about to be released to the Anglo-American peoples? Whether or not this is the case, the disreputable character of Richard Brothers certainly has been used as a target by those who dispute and those who attack notions of British Israelism. One work that I want to draw your attention to, and if you'll take a look below your questions, under the optional additional reading, well, let's just look at that now, because several of these are good volumes and quite helpful. Drop down to where, well, actually it's the last reference under information relevant to Richard Brothers. The volume by Clark Garrett, in my judgment, is probably the finest placement of Richard Brothers and all of the different things that he represented in its historical context of this French revolutionary Napoleonic age, where you have many people, not just Richard Brothers, but many prophets, both on the continent of Europe and in the British Isles, predicting, forecasting, and trying to make prophetic sense out of those events that engulfed the Europeans and the British around that time. Another one that you might find of interest, understanding that it comes from a highly critical perspective, is that by Cecil Roth, entitled The Nephew of the Almighty, an experimental account of the life and aftermath of Richard Brothers. Incidentally, it is in Roth's work that I have been able to find the first reference of the wrongly titled account of the volume that Brothers published in 1822. The earliest copyright that I've seen of that volume by Roth is 1933. And Roth's biographical portrait of Richard Brothers is a very negative one, one which I would not be surprised at all was crafted to discredit more than anything else. Who then was the first true exponent, the real developer, the one which, as the one quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia mentioned, would be, well, the one who was the systematizer, the one who raised the idea in its language to the dignity of a creed? There are various people who are sometimes given credit. In 1814, there is supposedly a volume published by one Ralph Wedgwood called the Book of Remembrance. There are those that would suggest that Wedgwood first developed the idea. A man named I.H. Frere published in the following year, 1815, the prophecies of David, Esdras, and John. Again, some people would connect him to that. And then a man named Murphy in 1816, a book called Proofs that Israelites Came from Egypt into Ireland. That volume is attributed to him, and in 1817 he's also given credit for writing a volume called Advocate of Israel and the Isle of Aaron. The difficulty with all of this, and I've checked references in with various search tools, and I've gone, the last trip I made to the British Library in 1997, the spring of this particular year, I went and checked specifically for all three of these authors. None of their volumes exist in that library, or at least their cataloging system has overlooked them if they have. I've never been able to locate any of these. Even if they do, one would be hard-pressed to find someone better than a man named John Wilson as the real founder, the one who gave form, substance, definition, and shape to the British Israel idea and argument. Wilson is a fascinating character. He was born in 1799. He died in 1870. He very probably was of Scottish origin. And in 1840, he published a book which is the foundational work. You'll see it referred to again in several places of your workbook here. It's the title that I've given on page 12. The top of the page is Lectures on Our Israelitish Origins, or origin. Evidently, Wilson had lectured during the 1830s. He had drawn crowds, audiences, to hear what he had to say about connecting the Israelites to the modern-day British. And by 1840, he had put into print the main outlines and contours that form the basis of the argument. John Wilson was an Anglican layman. He was an individual who believed in what you might call the identity truth. He believed as well that before Christ would return, and this is one of the driving engines that you find among many of the early British Israel writers, is this concept, this conviction that Christ would not return until this doctrine of understanding, this aspect of biblical truth was preached, was dispersed and disseminated, and was accepted. Only at that point would the second coming occur. And you can well imagine the urgency that added to the trumpeting then of the message. Again, with hindsight being 2020, we can look back across a span of what now, 157 years since this volume first appeared. Much to Wilson's disappointment, while the idea generated a great deal of interest, while Wilson was able to pack the lecture halls and the church pews, the Victorian middle class was essentially apathetic toward the idea. He drew the best of available temporary scholarship to frame his arguments. That's another dimension that we might want to take a moment to take a look at. The best example, I suppose, of this would be drawing on the writings of one of the major figures in British historiography, a man named Sherrod Turner. Turner wrote in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He produced a mammoth work, an opus magnus, a multi-volume series which is called A History of the Anglo-Saxon Peoples. It was published in successive volumes starting in 1799, running through 1805. And what Turner's work did, among other things, primarily, Turner sketched in the story with greater detail and historical integrity than anyone before him had ever done. His multi-volume work, which was based on extensive research drawn from the resources held in the British Library or British Museum, he developed in detail an account, one very much 19th century in flavor. But in the midst of that, the one strand which people like Wilson and others after him have drawn upon was that Turner seems to be the first to make the suggestion that the Anglo-Saxon people trace their origins back through Europe, through the Balkans region, and ultimately to the Crimea and the Caucasus mountain ranges, the Caucasus Mountains. And fascinatingly enough, that's precisely what we would expect. If you'll turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 5. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. Which is a parallel verse, by the way, to 2 Kings 17 and verse 6. They essentially say the same thing. But referring back to the Assyrian invasions of the northern kingdom and the deportation of what I will argue later in these lectures was the vast majority of the Israelite population in that kingdom. The narrator, the chronicler here says, "And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, the king of Assyria," which is to say the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, two names for the same individual. The Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and he carried them away, even the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them into Halah, and Habor, and Hara, and to the river Gozan, and they're there unto this day. That is precisely the region to which Sharon Turner, or in which Sharon Turner placed the origins of these Anglo-Saxons that eventually migrated into the British Isles and came to dominate them politically. Another volume which certainly bears examination is by a Canadian scholar whose name is Hugh McDougall. He did a little book of around 100 or so pages called Racial Myth in English History. And regarding Turner's work, McDougall has this to say. He says that Turner believed the Saxons were, quote, superbly endowed and directed by a kindly providence, implying that there was something special, something perhaps even divine, about the shepherding of these people out of their territory of origin and ultimately into the region where they would settle, put down roots, be planted, to use a term that is sometimes associated with this whole notion of the British Israelite ideas of settlement in the British Isles. Wilson's work coincides with the very time when Sharon Turner's historiography, or in other words, the writing of that particular branch of history, enjoyed its greatest influence, its widest circulation. It was when Turner's influence was at its peak. Now, another dimension of Wilson's contribution is where others, specifically Richard Brothers, had failed to do this. John Wilson rigorously connected Scripture, not always correctly, but nonetheless, he made those connections between scriptural references and the concepts and ideas and the unfolding history during which he himself lived. Wilson, and this is another criticism that oftentimes is leveled at British Israelite writers. It is oftentimes said of them that they have one shot in their gun. Their British Israel message is all that they have to say, leaving out the heart and core of so many other things in the Bible and in Scripture that far transcend in importance the notions, even if true, a critic would say, of the Israelites still being alive, well, cohesive, and in national form today. Wilson had an expansive knowledge of the Bible. His publications include a remarkably wide range of theological topics. Predictably, as oftentimes is the case with those who have taken up the British Israelite banner, much of what he writes about fits very nicely into the premillennialist view. The premillennialist perspective is the notion that there will come a millennial reign of Jesus Christ. Most advocates would argue that it will last 1,000 years. There will be a literal rule of Jesus Christ on this earth during that time frame, and it is yet to come. It will not come until after the literal bodily return of Jesus Christ to this earth. As an aside, it might also be worth our while to briefly note that Wilson, since the Church of God, from which most of you who purchase these video and audio tapes will come, since the Church of God is a Seventh-day Christian Sabbath-observing church, it is interesting to note that Wilson, in his works, at least in one specific place, lists reasons why he believes the Sabbath is no longer obligatory or mandatory, no longer necessary to keep. And yet, something that would gratify those of us who do believe in the binding nature of the Sabbath and the prophetic nature of the Sabbath as well. Specifically, that meaning that the Sabbath forecasts a time, it pictures a seventh day of rest in 7 millennial days of human history, a 1,000-year period during which Jesus Christ will live, reign, and rule on earth after His second coming. That typology is very well understood by John Wilson. He points through use of Sabbath typology to the coming millennial rest for the world, and does it quite eloquently, I might add, as well. Wilson also has insight into the Feast of Tabernacles and its connection to its symbolism representing that 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus Christ. He offers many interesting speculations about the end-time Elijah, many of which probably members of the Church of God certainly would not agree with, but fascinating reading nonetheless. John Wilson, during his career, proved to be a very popular public speaker. He addressed audiences that were made up, as I've already mentioned, primarily of the Victorian Britain middle class, a group of people which was fascinated in the middle 19th to late 19th century by the subject of prophecy. The interest in prophecy oftentimes is cyclical through the centuries. There'll be time when it rises, there'll be time when it wanes, there'll be time when it seems immediately relevant, there'll be time when it seems distant and far and perhaps totally unrelated to the things of the present. In tying the loose ends then, in terms of Wilson's contributions and his work, the timing of his publications is quite interesting. It is coincident with the flowering of British world power. Lectures on our Israelitish origin appeared only 3 years after the coronation of Queen Victoria, who in many respects is a kind of embodiment, a personification of Britain's grand golden imperial age. It is almost as though that God begins to open the understanding of the people in Britain, and to maybe some lesser degree the people in Europe, about the identity of Israel in modern times at precisely the same time when the flowering of British greatness begins to really get underway in earnest. Wilson's work unleashed a flood of literature that generally would go under the rubric, the heading of British Israelite or Anglo-Israelite literature. And that, in many respects, has continued virtually unabated through the 19th and on into the early 20th centuries. There are scores of authors that we could cite, and in the selected bibliography at the end of the workbook, I've given you some suggestions that you might want to later explore. I want to take a moment or two before we bring to closure in this lecture, about another 12 minutes or so, and then the next lecture that we'll have, bringing an end to the history of the British Israel idea. I want to focus in on at least a few specific figures who made particular contributions to the development, the growth, the flow, and the direction which the idea took. Probably the most significant of John Wilson's immediate successors was a man named Edward Hein. Hein was a banker. He was the office manager for a life insurance firm, and as he moved on into his own middle age, he became captivated and fascinated by these ideas of identifying the British people with the Israelites of old. His main and principal work is a volume entitled 47 Identifications. It originally appeared in 1869 under a title 17 Identifications, but over the next several years Hein developed his work, elaborated, enlarged, and eventually came down with an additional 30, bringing it to 47 identifications of the British people with the Israelites of old. Hein claims in his preface, in his introductory words to at least some of his books, that he sold around 50,000 copies of this volume. He was a major figure on the British Israel lecture circuit, much in the tradition of John Wilson, who traveled widely, who went to various places. Edward Hein did much the same thing, beginning his career in November of 1869. He claims to have addressed about 5 million people during his speaking career. During that time, he lectured in Ireland, he lectured in Scotland, he lectured in England, in some respects at venues as prestigious as Britain's Exeter Hall. He spent a 3-year tour of the United States of America in the late 19th century, from the years 1884 through 1886. He was across the Atlantic, speaking to audiences who were eager to hear, or at least be titillated by the possibilities of this fascinating and interesting connection. Much like Wilson, he saw the understanding of Israel's modern-day identity as relevant to policy formation affecting current events. This is one area in which you begin to get divergent opinions around the time of Edward Hein. Wilson, Hein, both of those individuals believed that the knowledge, the awareness, and the understanding of the Israelitish connection demanded that policy be conducted in a certain respect or way, whether it be political, economic, or social policy. This understanding had implications on policies of those kinds. Another British Israelite exponent, a man named Edward Wheeler Byrd, eschewed such notions. He, much like the churches of God in the mid to late 20th century, he drew back from notions or ideas which would entangle the British Israel movement and idea with particular political positions. Rather, he and those like Wheeler Byrd very much believed that it was incumbent to rely upon God to solve the problems, to fulfill the prophecies, and ultimately God was the only one who could correct the evils within the system of the world as it existed in their day and age. Going back to Hein, before we draw closure, Hein was a well-known figure in British society. 2 points, in many respects, much like Richard Brothers, we know that he attracted a good bit of attention. Edward Hein drew criticism from some fairly heavy hitters in 19th century British society. There were articles in the Saturday Review critiquing Hein's ideas. And no less than Canon George Rawlinson, who was a professor of history at Oxford University, one of the most prestigious institutions of higher education, not only in Britain, but in the world. Rawlinson took Hein to task. He deemed it worthy to draw on his own historical his own understanding of the history of antiquity to challenge. And in many of Hein's works, there are included in the appendices the exchanges that go back and forth between these two figures. Both the Saturday Review coverage and Rawlinson's taking to task Edward Hein showed the degree to which the British Israel idea commanded attention in the British Isles as you come to the close of the 19th century. As an aside, I feel almost duty and honor bound to make mention, Hein's works are marred by certain tendencies. And if you do take it upon yourself to find some of these works and read them, being forearmed or forewarned is to be forearmed. One thing that comes out very clearly in his works is an anti-Semitism. Edward Hein also was stridently anti-Irish. Indeed, in contrast to some of the other works of British Israelite writers who later would make a connection between the Celtic or Celtic people of Ireland with the ancient Israelite tribe of Dan, Hein had anti-Irish sympathies and actually even suggested that their origins, the origins of the Irish, go back to the Canaanites from the ancient Near East. Hein was also somewhat of a divisive force within the general body of the British Israelite community. He oftentimes took to task various colleagues. One of the best works, and I'll pause briefly here and make reference back to the workbook on page 12. If you look toward the top of the page, the second section down, I've written one of the best scholarly and most objective assessments of the early British Israel movement is, ironically, an article written by a modern scholar who comes out of a sociological background, and his name is John Wilson. He's not to be confused with the John Wilson of the 19th century, two entirely different people. But Wilson contributed a little essay in a larger volume edited by a man named Brian Wilson, and the essay is entitled British Israelism, The Ideological Restraints on Sect Organization. And it's found in the volume edited by Brian Wilson titled Patterns of Sectarianism. If you have an interest, you can probably obtain that volume through interlibrary loan service. I would say that to date, of the things that I've read on the subject matter, this essay is without a doubt the best, most scholarly, most honest assessment and evaluation, although I might not necessarily agree with everything that's said. It certainly, to me, is the best job in terms of scholarship I've ever seen in capturing and describing the nature of the early British Israelite movement, touching base with brothers and then going on and spending some extensive time developing the history in which John Wilson and Edward Hein wrote, achieved, and accomplished what they did within and for the movement. A few things about the nature of the idea itself. British Israelism defied denominational definition. In essence, we're looking at an idea that is interdenominational. Maybe a different and better way of saying that is there were many people from different denominations within Christianity who embraced the idea. And as John Wilson, the more recent Wilson, clearly indicates in his little essay, British Israelism did not become a sect or a denomination of and by itself. It was an idea that tended to be adopted by people from within existing sects. John Wilson of the 19th century, for instance, was an Anglican layman. He's probably representative of where the majority of believers where they came from. Most probably sprang out of the Anglican faith, but there were many others as well. In Canada, one of the writers who contributed to the Anglo-Israel body of literature was a man named Joseph Wilde. He came out of Toronto, where he was a Congregationalist minister. John Hardin Allen, who we've mentioned in earlier lectures, a Methodist minister who at least performed some of his ministry in the American Pacific Northwest. Another who made some fascinating contributions to the literature, an American, T. Rosling Howlett, a Baptist minister by denomination who had pastorates in New York City, in Washington, D.C., and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. By and large, British Israelism was non-proselytizing. Those who were on the lecture circuit, typically, at least the early ones, went, they spoke, they offered their ideas, and they went back home. The audience could take it or they could leave it, and as I've suggested already in the Wilson essay of recent date, certainly affirms this. Most found it fascinating, most found it stimulating intellectually, and most forgot about it and went their way. The uses to which the idea has been put has been, and I use this term advisedly, legion. It has been co-opted to justify various political agendas. It has been co-opted to justify various social agendas. British Israelism has been used as a tool to support imperialism or imperial expansion, to bring into subjection native peoples around the world. It has been used as a justification for socialism in terms of economic policy. It has been used, ironically as well, by various authors to combat communism. It has been used as an anti-Zionist idea. We could go on. There are other and perhaps less well-known things which the idea or the concept has been used to support, to propagate, and so on. Once again, as I mentioned in the lecture number, 4 it would be, the idea itself is not inherently socialist. It is not inherently imperialist. It is not inherently anti-communist, anti-Zionist, racist. You fill in the blank. It is the use to which various exponents have put the idea that tends to make it good or make it bad. Well, that brings closure, and we're at a nice point at which to break off Lecture 5. We'll come back again next time. In parting, I would say, as you look at your questions, you should now be able, based on what we've covered in this 5th of the lecture series, to answer questions 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 in terms of responding to the workbook material. Well, we'll wrap it up then for this time, and we'll see you again soon.